Welcome, everyone, to today's Associates meeting with SIEPR, the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research. I'm Mark Duggan, the Trione Director of SIEPR, and I'm so glad that you're able to join us for our final event of 2020. We're very lucky to have Josh Bolten with us today. I'm really looking forward to hearing his take on what we can expect from the Biden administration when it comes to business and economic policies in 2021 and beyond. But before getting to today's event, I just want to take a moment to say how much I appreciate all of the support that you've shown to SIEPR during the past year. We've all been truly upended by the pandemic and pulled in so many different directions. But our SIEPR community has not only come together in this time, it's also grown as we've extended the reach of our events by having them online. We already have an exciting lineup of speakers and events for early 2021. Lloyd Dean, the CEO of Common Spirit Health, will be with us right after the winter break on January 6th. In February, Vivian Lee from Verily Life Sciences will be headlining our associates meeting. And in March, we'll be holding our annual SIEPR Economic Summit with Satya Nadella from Microsoft and many others. More details will be coming to you soon on all of those and some other events, and I'm really looking forward to having you join us. We are doing our absolute best to bring you leading thinkers from the academic, business, and policy communities who can share their insights with you and energize you about some of the most pressing challenges that we face here in the US and around the world. And on that note, I'm absolutely thrilled that Josh Bolten is with us today. Josh is the president and CEO of the Business Roundtable, which is an influential association of CEOs of leading US companies. Before joining the Business Roundtable in January 2017, Josh was the managing director of Rock Creek Global Advisors, a consulting firm that he co-founded in 2011. He was also a visiting professor in the School of Public Policy at Princeton, and he has 20 years of government service on his resume, including 8 years of service during the administration of President George W. Bush. He served as the president's chief of staff from 2006 to 2009, and as the director of the Office of Management and Budget prior to that. He also has strong ties to Stanford, having received his JD from our law school back in 1980, soon after graduating from Princeton, where he was the president of his class. We are very pleased to welcome Josh back, at least virtually, to the farm in what would I think be the season of his 40th law school reunion. Josh knows better than just about anyone how Washington, D.C. works, and he has great insights into the relationships between policymakers and the business community as well. We're really lucky to have him give us some perspective on what we can expect from the upcoming administration. So just to preview, after Josh gives some introductory remarks, I'll have a bit of a conversation with him. Then we'll have an opportunity for Q&A where you can submit your questions through the link that should be on your screens. And we'll try to get through as many of your questions as we can in the time that we have. And before turning it over to him, let me just say that I hope you all have a fun-filled, meaningful, and relaxing holiday season. And I wish all of you and your families a safe and healthy 2021. But with that, let me please join me in welcoming Josh Bolten back to the farm to SIEPR. So Josh, thanks for being with us today.
Mark, thanks for having me. It really is a thrill to be back at the farm. I'm grateful, especially for the background you've put up. That is my memory of my 3 years on the Stanford campus. And they are indeed great memories, and I remain very, very close to the university, close to the law school, and close to many of the scholars currently at Hoover and elsewhere around the university, with whom I had the privilege of serving in government. A special shout out, if I may, Mark, to Secretary George Shultz, who I know is one of your advisors, celebrating his 100th year this year. There's nobody that I can think of who is more admired and more emulated, usually unsuccessfully, by generations of public servants. And I'm proud to have had a chance. Actually, he probably isn't even aware I served under him at the State Department in the early '80s, shortly after I graduated from law school. But I've long admired him, including during my tenure as one of his successors in the budget office. So special greetings to Secretary Shultz. Mark, I want to I'd prefer to get just straight into questions, but let me, if you'll permit me, just say a couple of words about the Business Roundtable, which is my current day job, and where I am today is in my office at the headquarters of the Business Roundtable in Washington, D.C. It's an organization of now just over 200 CEOs of America's largest companies, and they come together in this organization, not representing their companies. They come here, the member is the CEO, not the company, but they come here in their capacity as business leaders, significant business leaders, to advocate on behalf of the U.S. economy and the country in general, and to share perspectives and best practices. So I currently have what I think is one of the best jobs, certainly in Washington, maybe in America, of being able to serve essentially as the executive director of this group of terrific business leaders who care a great deal about the country and give us the luxury of advocating on behalf of the policies that, especially the economic policies that they think will make the country better. And I'm hopeful that we're doing that even in the wacky political environment that we find ourselves today. Mark, I'll pause there and let you dig in on the issues.
Great. Well, Josh, thanks for that nice intro. And because this is a SIEPR event, Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research, maybe I'll sort of start on the economic policy front, and just ask you to give sort of a high level based on your your experience in DC, your sense of where things stand politically, kind of what you think can get done in 2021 by policymakers. There's obviously, we've got this pandemic going, a lot of challenges that's putting on our healthcare system and on our on individuals and families and employers and so forth. And we saw today that unemployment insurance claims were up a significant amount, which is very unfortunate, suggesting that maybe the recovery is stalling. But there's obviously some immediate short-term issues right now. There's negotiations going on in DC. Something could happen even before the inauguration next month. So just talk a little bit about what you see happening on, let's say between now and inauguration and beyond that. And feel free to mention your take on what's happening in Georgia too.
Okay.
There's a lot in there. So I just,
all right.
Well,
thanks for giving me an opportunity to talk first about what's happening between now and January 20th, because it really is important. First of all, by far the most important thing, obviously, in the country is the pandemic, and the same is true in government circles, which is that the top priority right now in Washington and for the incoming administration as well as the outgoing is try to get the health policy right, to deal with the health crisis we've got on our hands and the economic crisis that is the result of the health crisis. That's the top priority of the business leaders I represent, and that's the top priority of everybody in Washington right now. The Congress having put out what I think was pretty effective and successful relief in March in the CARES Act has basically stalled and gridlocked since then on providing additional relief to individuals, to small businesses, to states and localities, and to the health response effort. Now, there's reasonable debate about what ought to be done in what measure for whom, but I don't think there should be any doubt that some additional relief from the federal government is going to be critical to see a lot of folks over to the other side of the pandemic, which we can now see there's some light at the end of the tunnel with the impending distribution of effective vaccines, which is spectacularly good news, but still a ways away. So broad consensus in the business community as well as the political community that Congress needs to appropriate some more money. They're stuck on how much and to whom. The big political disconnect right now is that Republicans are insisting on liability protection for businesses, which I think is important. Democrats are insisting on a very substantial subsidy to state and local governments. And both sides oppose the other's priority and are holding the rest of the relief that they agree on hostage. And the rest of the relief includes support for small businesses, probably some transfer to individuals, and also support for the public health system. From the standpoint of the business community, for the big business community that I represent, a very interesting thing, Mark, that I found when we first consulted our members at the outset of the pandemic. We went to our board in March and asked for guidance on what should we be lobbying for on Capitol Hill in the way of relief. And with the exception of the airline industry, for which the pandemic has been and remains an existential crisis, nobody said, help me. Nobody said, get me a subsidy. Bearing in mind that these are America's largest corporations. But what they did say is that they're worried about their employees, their customers, and above all, their suppliers. That if you think of an operation like Boeing or Raytheon, those are big industrial companies that have been badly slammed in the course of the pandemic. But a big anxiety for them is in some cases, 10 or 20,000 suppliers that they have, small business suppliers who while I'm confident that Boeing and Raytheon will make it to the other side of the pandemic, a lot of those suppliers may not, and that will be a big impediment to recovery. So as we're lobbying lobbying the Congress on what should be done, our focus is actually on keep the small businesses alive so that as we get to the other side of the pandemic, a return to robust economic activity will be possible. Now, so that's the main focus is get the right money out the door to the right people before the Congress goes home for Christmas. The other big thing that you mentioned, Mark, is January 5th, and that's the runoff in Georgia for the 2 Senate seats there. As most people know, if Democrats take both of those seats, they will retrieve control of the Senate. If Republicans take at least one of those seats, Republicans will remain in control of the Senate. And that has huge significance for what happens in 2021 and 2022. Because control of the Senate will be a big determinant of the policy agenda here in Washington, with it being basically binary with respect to 2 issues. One is tax and the other is healthcare. If Republicans control the Senate after January 5th, there will be no major tax legislation in the coming Congress. and there's unlikely to be substantial healthcare legislation. If Democrats control the Senate after that, there very likely will be. And Mark, I'll pause there and let you dig in on whatever details you think might be interesting.
Great. So that is, yeah, there's so much there. And you've been very involved in government over many years, and you've been involved with transitions into and out of. And it's interesting. I served previously in DC only once, 2009 and 2010 in the Obama administration of the CEA. And it was a very different landscape then, in the sense that 59% of the House was Democrat, 59% of the Senate was Democrat. That actually flipped to 60%, I think, in April when Arlen Specter switched parties. So it's just a very different landscape. And obviously the economy was in a very different place. Here we sort of have a recovery, although as you mentioned, it's sort of stalling a little bit. But perhaps you can just walk through, in both of those scenarios, the sort of Democrats win 2 versus Republicans win 1 or 2 in the Senate. What scenarios do you view as, so it sounds like no major tax or healthcare legislation if Democrats do not control the Senate, but are there things that can get done even if Democrats do not control the Senate? And where, if you were the Biden administration coming in, where would you direct your energies? Obviously COVID is the pandemic and is obviously first order issue, but are there other places where you see opportunities for collaboration?
Yeah. First, a quick note about if Democrats control, and we do get this tax legislation and the healthcare legislation, it won't be trivial. Candidate Biden campaigned on basically unwinding the 2017 tax cuts that President Trump got enacted, and has proposed increases, pretty dramatic increases on the individual side, at least for those making above $400,000 a year. He also proposed significant increases in the corporate rate, which in the 2017 tax law was brought down from 31% to 21%. Candidate Biden proposed to be raised up to 28. I don't know if he could get all the way up there with an all-Democratic Congress, but he could probably get pretty close. And he campaigned on a new corporate minimum tax. So the significance of the tax legislation, both to individuals, which is where a lot of America's small businesses pay their taxes through the individual side of the income tax code, and to corporations, it would not be trivial. It would be a very substantial tax increase in the low trillions over 10 years. That legislation would likely be combined with healthcare legislation. Candidate Biden proposed not Medicare for all, but he did propose a public option, which he might not be able to persuade a narrowly divided but Democratic Senate to go along with whole hog, but we could expect a lot of that. And he'd probably have success and lower the Medicare retirement age. So there would be substantially higher taxes, offset in large measure by much higher spending on healthcare as more and more people rely on federal subsidies for their health care. So we shouldn't underestimate that difference. Now, if it's a Republican Senate, as you postulated, and most of the political prognosticators think that will be the outcome, although it's such a crazy year, it's hard to say. But the base case scenario for most of the experts with whom I've spoken is Republicans win both of those seats. They retain the Senate. There still remains a pretty substantial agenda for a Biden administration and a new Congress, beginning with infrastructure investment. And you asked what would I like to see them put their effort into. The folks that I represent would really like to see substantial infrastructure investment in this country, which has been lagging for years, if not decades. That means roads, bridges, waterways, and so on. I'm talking now principally about the transportation infrastructure, but also an emerging strong bipartisan consensus that we need to make much larger investments in the infrastructure of broadband. And there's a confluence of political interests here because Republicans want broadband spread much more widely and effectively in rural areas. Democrats want it in underserved urban areas. And so when Republicans want to spend on something in one part of the country and Democrats want to spend on something in the same thing in their part of the country, you can be pretty sure it's likely to happen. And so I would be cautiously optimistic that in the context of additional COVID relief legislation, COVID recovery legislation that's likely coming in the first half of 2021, traveling along with that as part of emergency legislation is likely to be some substantial investment in infrastructure, and infrastructure now more broadly defined to include broadband.
Great. Thanks so much for that. And that is really interesting, that the infrastructure, making that point that about the spending in the different areas. One question I have for you, so you were formerly the director of OMB, so you understand the federal budget probably better than just about anyone on the planet. And I'm curious as to whether you think policymakers will start, and maybe they already are and I'm just missing it, but start to articulate to people the changes, the incredible changes that are underway in the demographics of the country and the strain that's going to put on the government going forward. If you look less than a year ago, the CBO projected that the debt to GDP ratio in the US was going to reach 100% of GDP in 2030, okay? But now we're at 100% of GDP. And there's this sort of debate going on, like obviously you don't want to over worry about the debt when we're in this pandemic and the recovery from it and so forth. But just going forward, do you see that playing an increasingly important role in what the government is able to do? Because mechanically, as the demographics are changing, government spending is going up, government tax revenues are declining, all else equal, as the number of workers grows much more slowly than the number of retirees. So can you just talk about how you see that? Is that going to be an important factor over the next few years? I wrote this policy brief last week about Medicare trust fund is coming. There's just a lot of challenges on the horizon. So do you see those as we don't need to really worry about those, or how do you think about it?
Yeah, maybe Mark,
low interest rates are low, so maybe we're fine. But yeah, curious.
Yeah. Well, that last part is the attitude of almost everybody, every politician in Washington these days. And I saw your paper, which I commend to everybody here. I don't know whether it's on the SIEPR website or.
It's on the SIEPR website. It's a real page turner for everyone who's watching.
Oh, I thought it was. I thought it was really good and interesting. Medicare trust fund, Social Security trust fund, stuff that no one in Washington is paying any attention to right now, Mark, I have to tell you. And therefore, other people need to pay more attention. I'll go back to when I first became budget director in 2003. And Keith Hennessy will remember this. I don't know if he's on the line, but I know he's one of your affiliates, and just a spectacular government servant, and somebody from whom I and the president learned a lot over the course of his years in the White House. But Keith will remember that when I came in as budget director in 2003, I was horrified as my first major public responsibility that I was going to have to go out and announce at a press conference that OMB was projecting a deficit that could peak above $400 billion in the coming fiscal year, which at the time would have been, I think, over 3% of GDP. And I was worried that my first press conference as the budget director was going to cause a collapse in the financial markets. And I was worried about not just the financial markets, I was worried about an actual collapse in the finances of the United States and in confidence in the United States. And took it as my principal responsibility to do what we could to bring that deficit back down, which we did over the course of the subsequent years, even while fighting wars until the financial crisis. But the deficits remained low. Significantly at that time, one thing I was worried about was the US debt to GDP ratio going above 40%, which I thought was some kind of Maginot Line that ought not be crossed. And as you point out, here we are today, above 100% of GDP, with multi-trillion dollar deficits. We had the Obama years where there were many years of trillion-dollar deficits. We're now into the multi-trillion, and yet no reaction from the financial markets. We continue to have historically low interest rates, from which our economy and the businesses in my organization continue to benefit. And the question is, Mark, that you're posing is, has the revenge of the financial markets been repealed? I don't think it has been. We've got to find a way to get to stability in the spending of the federal government, and the demographic factors you pointed out and you point out in your paper are the ones that are really driving the problem. The problem in the United States budget situation is not that we are spending too much on our military or on national parks or on anything that goes through the discretionary side of the budget, which is what the Congress actually appropriates every year. The problem is on the inaptly named mandatory side of the budget, the entitlements, which are what are growing exponentially over time because of the demographic factors you talked about. So we're now in a situation where 2/3 of the federal budget is made up of spending on Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and interest on the debt. And those numbers are only going up. And the only way to get hold of and manage this otherwise, I believe, very dangerous budgetary situation is for government policymakers to come around and realize that we need to restrain the growth in that spending. It doesn't mean we need to cut it, but we basically have an entitlement system that is designed to take care of too many people in our society. We need a safety net, but the kind of spending we have cannot be sustained over the long term. Needs to be reined in. I fear that there's certainly no political appetite to do that in Washington now, and that's been demonstrated with a Republican president and Republican houses over the last 4 years. It's unlikely to improve dramatically over the course of the Biden administration. Although footnote here is that the best circumstance for fiscal restraint is probably a Democratic president facing at least one Republican House. That is probably the best recipe for fiscal restraint that we have. But policymakers do need to get serious about it, and by current evidence, they probably won't get serious about it until there really is a financial crisis.
Okay, well, that's an uplifting prediction, but I'd a little bit share that view. So let's pivot a little bit to some of your work at Business Roundtable, and I'm going to start. I'm going to ask 2 more questions, and then we've got some great questions coming in from our attendees, virtual attendees. So one is on, as you surely know, it's been more than a year now since the Business Roundtable statement on sort of stakeholder capitalism. And so can you walk us through a little bit, the sort of what that is, what changes you have seen as a result of that, and it's been criticized. Actually, 3 or 4 of our senior fellows wrote an op-ed earlier this year criticizing this statement, this BOT statement. So just can you talk a little bit about the rationale for it, what effect it's having, and your response to some of the criticisms? And I can try to be more specific on the criticism, but I think you know.
Yeah. Well, thank you for asking about that. A year ago, last August, the Business Roundtable revised one of the sort of standard statements we have on the books. We keep a series of principles of corporate governance, have since the organization's founding almost 50 years ago. And in the 90s, the portion of the principles that define the purpose of a corporation was amended to say that the purpose of a corporation is to maximize shareholder value. This was essentially, I'm paraphrasing, but that was essentially the statement. And over the course of the last few years, we began to see that that wasn't the way that our CEOs articulated their mission and their purpose, and it wasn't the way they behaved, and did not reflect the reality of how the modern CEO runs his or her corporation. So we revised the statement, in August of 2019 to say that the purpose of a corporation is to promote all of its stakeholders, its customers, its employees, its suppliers, its communities, and its shareholders. And that if you take care of the first 4 properly, you will be taking care of the long-term shareholder. Not necessarily the short-term shareholder, whose interest is in what's your earnings per share next quarter, but the long-term shareholder who is interested in the long-term health of the enterprise. And so, while some of the criticism has been a suggestion that you're moving away from capitalism, the way our members viewed it is the statement was designed to buttress support for the kind of for successful capitalism, with a disfavoring of the short-term investor in favor of the long-term investor. I think that's the right lens through which to view the statement, is that it is a downgrading of the short-term investor to the benefit of the long-term investor, and it's a recognition that CEOs and modern CEOs go to work each day worried about creating shareholder value, but doing so by taking care of all of their stakeholders. That was the rationale behind the statement. We knew it was an important statement at the time, and we did something unusual for the organization, is that we circulated it to all of our, I think at the time, 186 members for their personal signature, and all but I think 7 signed, and the 7 included some sort of a couple of peculiar cases where they weren't publicly held companies, so they thought, well, the shareholder stuff isn't relevant to us. But basically reflecting a very strong consensus of the major corporate community, to the extent that they were all willing to put their signature, at the personal signature, at the bottom of this statement. And the day after we released the statement, or the day we released the statement, we took out a 2-page ad in the Wall Street Journal. The first 2/3 of a page was the statement and its preamble, and the rest of the advertisement, 1 1/3 pages, was the signatures of roughly 180 of America's leading CEOs putting their names to it. The very next day, the Wall Street Journal, to whom we had paid, I'm thinking a couple $100,000 for those 2 pages, the Wall Street Journal savaged us on its editorial page as undermining capitalism. And similar themes were picked up by people at Stanford, at Hoover, whom I respect greatly, including, I think it was Michael Boskin, John Kogan, and maybe John Taylor was involved too with it. Those are great.
Right.
And all of whom are heroes of mine, icons. And I called at least one of them up and made the case that we're not trying to disrupt or undermine capitalism. We're trying to buttress it, and reflect the way CEOs actually behave, and communicate that to a public which believes that major corporations are in fact run solely for the benefit of rich people, which aren't them. And to me, that is a corrosive narrative in our society, and I'm proud we're doing our part to rebut it.
Great, thanks, Josh, for that. We've got a few questions coming in, and I was planning to ask in this area too, just for your thoughts on sort of the climate change front. As you know, from your position at Business Roundtable, from your experience in government, is there a sort of Business Roundtable position about things like a carbon tax? Do you have a sense of what would be a good direction for the country to go in on this front to try to tackle this problem? There's obviously a big international component to it, in the sense that the US is less than 5% of the world's population. This is a truly global issue, CO2, which is different from a lot of other things like, let's say, sulfur dioxide. So can you talk a bit about your perspectives, both from where you are now at Business Roundtable and your experience in government, as to what you think is possible / probable on this front in the coming years?
Yeah, well, here's a news flash that may surprise some of your some of the participants in the organization. Business Roundtable, the CEOs of Business Roundtable want legislation. They want Congress to act to address climate change. Now, years ago, most CEOs came around to the view that climate change is a serious problem that needs to be addressed through some sort of public policy. But the fact that we got a consensus within the Business Roundtable this year to put out a statement that says corporate leaders of America want Congress to legislate on greenhouse gas emissions, on CO2, and they want that done through a market mechanism. The statement we put out in, I think it was September. It was supposed to come out in March, but got knocked off by the pandemic. The statement we put out in September says we want a price on carbon, and then we will be able to adjust our business activities. We will be able to plan and invest in a rational way to make that happen. Now, there's a split in the membership over exactly how to put a price on carbon, and it's not a trivial detail. But we felt it was worthwhile, even though we couldn't get a consensus on a carbon tax versus other kinds of price mechanisms. But by the way, I think a plurality would probably support a carbon tax. I don't know that for sure. It'd be narrow, but probably a plurality of the BRT membership would support a carbon tax. But they want a price on carbon, and we thought it was worthwhile to put our portion of the business community on record in favor of that, and see what can be done. I'm personally optimistic that there is a solution, a public policy solution out there that makes sense for the country, that has potential enormous transitional economic disruptions that need to be mitigated in some way. And it's enormously complex to approach. But I'm personally optimistic that there is a solution out there that can be crafted, that would make sense for the country and make sense for continued economic viability, which is the immediate trade-off we're facing. The bad news is that from where we sit today, it's very hard to see even a Democratic Congress, a Democratic Senate, and a Democratic House coming around to legislation that can gather enough support to make it through the Congress. And in the absence of that, or even with the prospect, if you were very optimistic about the prospect of legislation, what's likely to happen in the meantime, even in the early months of a Biden administration, is a much more heavy-handed regulatory approach, which most of our companies consider will likely be pretty damaging to their business operations, to their competitiveness. Not because, and we will oppose it, not because we want to put the head in the sand on the climate crisis, but because a regulatory approach is bound to create all sorts of discontinuities and problems in the unintended consequences that are very hard to manage and very bad for a lot of our businesses.
Great, thanks very much for that. And now I'm getting several questions on two areas that many in the SIEPR community care a lot about, and that is trade policy and immigration policy. And I could ask them separately, but they're sort of, I don't know, they're sufficiently close that I'll just ask you to sort of, where do you think we are?
Ask them separately.
Okay, so all right, so what? Here, I'll read one verbatim. How should U.S. trade policy change? How will it change? So those may not be the same two.
Yeah. The past 4 years have been very disruptive for trade policy, but it may be what the people wanted. In other words, President Trump, I think, probably correctly assessed that to the extent any specific policy issue got him elected president, it was hostility toward trade, and in particular toward China. So I think the voter got what he and she wanted when they elected President Trump, which is a president who, in unprecedented ways, for presidents of either party, came into office and governed with a hostility toward the international trading system that we've enjoyed in the post-World War II era. How should it change? How will it change? certainly from my standpoint, we need to get back to a much greater appreciation of the multilateral rules that have made the trading system fundamentally successful in the post-war era. And we need to get back to avoiding unnecessary confrontation with our friends and allies over trade issues that aren't really the problem. I mean, the fundamental underlying problem in the U.S. economy that many voters were reacting to is a lack of competitiveness in the United States and a lack of good jobs when jobs that are tied to our uncompetitive industries disappear. And that's not to suggest that we shouldn't take care of the folks who end up being the victims of a open international trading system. In fact, I think one of the errors of the past 20 years has been that those who support an open international trading system have not been candid enough in acknowledging that there is collateral damage caused by that system, and we need to take care of the people who are the victims of it. But we definitely need to get back to it. Otherwise, the U.S. is consigning itself in a now much more bipolar economic world to being the less competitive, increasingly less competitive country. China is the big issue in international trade. China was the subject of many of President Trump's confrontations. The business community would welcome a lowering of the rhetoric, but the business community also recognizes that President Trump was not entirely misdiagnosing the problem. The China that we have on the world scene today is very different from the one that we hoped and expected 20 years ago as it entered the global economic system, would increasingly become more like the Western democracies, both in their behavior at home and in their economic policies. And that looked like a pretty good bet for about the first decade of this century. And it's turned out it's been a very bad bet, and very clearly in the second decade of this century, as China has become increasingly statist, continues heavy subsidization of state industries, maintains a large number of barriers to access to the Chinese market, although those are beginning to diminish, does not adequately protect intellectual property, and targets competitive industries of the future for particular state support. And these are all enormous economic challenges to the United States and to the rest of Western economies. And those challenges are not going away just because President Biden isn't going to be quite as discourteous to the Chinese as President Trump has been. A little bit of civility here is not going to solve the problem. So there will be ongoing confrontation on the economic front with China. And if anything, while lowering the rhetoric, President Biden is very likely to expand the playing field, because among a Biden administration's priorities are likely to be political freedom in China, human rights, and military expansionism, none of which has been a particular priority of the Trump administration. And as the Biden administration focuses on those things, the playing field of confrontation with the Chinese will expand. So as to what's going to happen on trade policy, I think we will have hopefully more rational, but ongoing confrontation with China on all of those fronts. And hopefully, as the Biden administration has promised, a closer relationship with our allies, without whom confronting the competitive threat from China is infinitely more difficult.
That was, yeah, thanks so much for all of that. Super insightful. So just pivoting a little bit, I'll come back to immigration policy in a second. We've got lots of great questions. One area that I do want to touch on, because you touched on it a little bit, is in the US, the regulation of big tech companies. So this is an area of great interest to many SIEPR faculty, is sort of how to get, how to optimize the regulation of things like market power. And, people think a lot about those, have thought about those issues for many years in other industries, let's say in the healthcare sector or in the airline industry or what have you. And now, obviously, it's, we're hearing more and more about these large companies, whether it's, sort of Facebook, Google type companies. So can you talk a little bit about your sense of what may be coming down the pike on that front, and how you think about those trade-offs of a sort of hands-off approach, but just let things be as they are, or some sort of intervention / regulation?
It's definitely headed toward the latter. And here's another peculiar place where Republicans and Democrats seem to be arriving at the same position, which is one of deep suspicion and hostility toward especially the big tech platforms, which means Google and Facebook in particular, but a lot of the rest of the tech community in the political crosshairs for a variety of reasons, but not least being market power, which is the way to attack it. So whether you're a conservative who thinks that Facebook has been intentionally suppressing conservative messaging on its platform, or a liberal who thinks that or progressive who thinks that Facebook has been enabling right-wing craziness on its platform. It's all converging now to believe that those things need to be reined in. Now, one place to do the reining in is with respect to enforcement of our antitrust laws, which I would not be at all surprised over the course of a Biden administration to have a very substantial reconsideration of antitrust principles that we've lived under for 50 years now, or longer. On the one hand, and on the other hand is to possibly treat the platforms like utilities that require government regulation, a much stronger hand of government regulation in how they use their unusual position today in the social and economic ecosystem. So a confluence of things that I think will create a substantial change in policy over the course of the next 4 or 8 years.
Super helpful. Thank you so much for that. And I do wish we could have you on for like 4 hours, because we've had so many good questions, but I'm trying to pick some of them. So for those who are watching, questions, I apologize. But so on the immigration front, so yeah, let's talk a little bit about that. It's an issue that a lot of people here at Stanford care about. A lot of students care about, not just from their own perspective. We have many international students at Stanford, obviously, but sort of what there have been a lot of developments with respect to immigration policy over the last 4 years. So your take on what it should be and what is likely to happen on that front as well.
The business community has had, over the course of the Trump era, has had 2 areas of real substantial policy disagreement with the Trump administration. Put aside the president's own personal behavior or his rhetoric, but just on a purely, here's what they're doing on a policy basis. The two substantial areas of biggest confrontation between a Trump administration and the business community have been international trade, which we just talked about, and the other one is immigration, where not just on a humanitarian basis, but on a business and economic basis, the folks in the business community have been very opposed to the many different ways that a Trump administration has sought to limit immigration into this country. That is one of the biggest changes that we will see in a Biden administration. I know that Stanford has been strongly supportive of the Dreamers in its community, as have many other educational institutions. That's an area where I very much expect the Biden administration will take early administrative action to try to put the Dreamers into at least a temporarily comfortable situation. The same with folks from Central America who have been here in the United States, for many of them for a decade or more, on a temporary status that the Trump administration had threatened to withdraw. Those measures I expect to happen very early on in a Biden administration. Now, the best thing to do is have a comprehensive overhaul of our immigration system. President George W. Bush got very close in 2006 and 2007 with a proposal that was very similar to the proposal that President Obama got very close to in, I can't remember, it was 11, 12, Mark?
That's about right.
Still have been there. You might still have been there for that, which involve basically expanding legal immigration into this country, on regularizing those 10 to 12 million who are here illegally, but are basically woven into the fabric of our society. So give them at least a regularized status, if not an easy path to citizenship, which many people advocate for. And from the standpoint of the business community, focus the expansion on skills-based immigration. We should be a magnet for all of the high-skilled people who really do still want to come to America. And we do this crazy thing where we train somebody at Stanford to be one of the best engineers in the world, and then we kick them out, and so they end up going back to China or wherever they came from. We ought to be stapling a visa at a minimum to that Stanford diploma, and say, we want you to stay. And that's where the business community strongly is. It's a brutally tough political issue, but I'm ever the optimist on it, and I think regardless of who controls the Senate, I think there is a reasonable prospect for comprehensive immigration reform legislation, not early in a Biden administration, but sometime in the Biden administration.
Well, Josh, thank you so much for your insights. As I said, I could literally stay on with you for another 3 hours. You know so much, and there's so many interesting things that are happening here in the U.S. and around the world. But I'm just so grateful to you for making time to connect with the SIEPR community today, given your really unique perspective from the business community and also from the halls of economic policy. Maybe just I'll give you like just a final minute, so to just sort of wrap up with what you see as what big takeaways for what lies ahead in terms of economic policy in the U.S. What do you flag as sort of most significant?
Well, Mark, let me flag about the pandemic, because I mean I'm in a funny position here representing all of these mega businesses, the Walmarts, Amazons, Microsofts of America, who have actually flourished during the course of the pandemic. Just to say that first, on the one hand, those business leaders are indeed medium to long term quite optimistic that when we took a poll, we poll our members every quarter for, we get their optimism. We have an optimism index that we put out, and we often ask a special question. We asked them, when do you think your business will be back to pre-pandemic levels? And 26% in the poll we just completed a week ago, 26% of them said already there or will be by the end of the year. Not bad. 41% said sometime in 21, and 33% said 22 or beyond. And they're fundamentally optimistic about it. But they're also very sober about the prospects for their own business, but they're very sober about what's happening in the rest of the country. And that's I want to leave on an unfortunately sober note, which is that there are a lot of small businesses and individuals in this country who will have suffered such damage during the course of this crisis that the entire rest of the country needs to be, our policy needs to be dedicated to making sure that that those people don't fall through the net. And that's especially true over the course of the next 3 months, because one of the things I was privileged to do is here in Washington is spend some time with the folks at CDC, Dr. Robert Redfield, and he was quite downbeat about what's going to be happening in the country during the course of this winter. That the level of deaths and hospitalizations, with many healthcare systems being overrun, the level of suffering in this country, I think, is beyond what people are expecting today. So I would just encourage people, A, to stay safe, B, take care of the less fortunate around you, which I know is very much embedded in the Stanford ethos, and then have great optimism about what's around the bend, because by the middle or fall of this year, vaccines should be widely distributed, and through the miracle of science, much of it being conducted right there in your neighborhood, I think the prospects for the United States are quite bright.
Thank you for ending then on a very uplifting note, and yeah, I think it is. We're so grateful to you for making time today, all of us at SIEPR. And I just want to also thank all who tuned in for today's event, and wish everyone who's watching a happy and healthy and safe holiday season. And thank you so much for being with us at SIEPR, and for all of your support, and best wishes for the year ahead as well. So thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you, Mark.
You bet.